Hi, I'm Paul, and in today's video, we're diving deep into MetaBind, a powerful community plugin. You'll learn how to create interactive input fields, and we'll explore practical examples together. We're going to start with the basics, and I'll show you how to seamlessly integrate these input fields into your own Obsidian vault. Whether you're new to MetaBind or already have some experience, there's something here for everyone. Join me as we unlock the full potential of MetaBind together. What is Metadata? The Metadata plugin makes your notes interactive with input fields, view fields, and buttons. Metadata allows you to use these fields inside your notes. The Metadata input and view fields can then be bound to front matter YAML properties, which keeps them in sync with those front matter properties. This allows you to edit and view your front matter properties inside your notes. What are Metadata view fields? View fields are a powerful way to reactively display your metadata in your notes. View fields can bind to multiple front matter fields, and the view field will update as soon as the value of the front matter field changes. What are MetaBind input fields? Input fields allow you to create input fields in your notes. When you interact with them in live preview and reading mode, they can be bound to your YAML properties. Did you know there are 21 input fields that you can use in Obsidian? Let's dive in and quickly explore all of them. MetaBind Input Field Showcase. A date input field is the Obsidian native date input. The date format is dependent on your Obsidian date format settings, which is dependent on your system settings. A date picker input field is a simple date picker that treats null as no set date. The date format can be changed in the plugin settings. A date time input combines the date and time input fields. The date format is dependent on your Obsidian date format setting, which is dependent on your system settings. An editor input field is similar to a text area, but with full markdown support. An image list suggester input field allows for multiple selections from a gallery of images. Images can be moved and deleted from a list by right-clicking on the image. An image suggester input field allows for a selection from a gallery of images. The image can be changed by clicking the pencil icon on the right side of the input field. An inline list input field allows you to add and remove elements to an inline displayed list. Clicking the plus button at the end of the list will open a text input modal, which will add a new element to the list. Elements can be moved, edited, and deleted from the list by right-clicking on the element and selecting the appropriate action. An inline list suggester input field allows you to add and remove elements to an inline displayed list. Clicking the plus button at the end of the list will open a suggester modal similar to the list suggester, which you can add a new element to the list. Elements can then be moved, edited, and deleted from the list by right-clicking on the element and selecting the appropriate action. An inline select input field functions like a drop-down menu. It allows you to select a certain value from a list of options. Options can be added using the option argument. A list input field allows you to add and remove elements to a list. Elements can be moved, edited, and deleted from the list by right-clicking on the element and selecting the appropriate action. A list suggester input field allows you to add and remove elements to a list using a suggester input. Elements can be moved and deleted from the list by right-clicking on the element and selecting the appropriate action. A multi-select input field allows you to select multiple values from a list of options. Options can be added using the option argument. A number input field is a text-like input field that only accepts numbers. A progress bar input field takes the full width of a note and can move within a certain value range. The range can be controlled with the min value and max value arguments. A select input field allows you to select a certain value from a list of options. Options can be added using the option argument. A slider input field is a slider that can move within a certain value range. The range can be controlled with the min value and max value arguments. A suggester input field allows selection from a fuzzy search modal. A text input field is a simple inline text input field. Unfortunately, Markdown is not supported. A text area input field is a simple text area input field. Markdown is also not supported. A time input field is the Obsidian native time input. The date format is dependent on your Obsidian date format setting, which is dependent on your system settings. A toggle input field acts like a switch that can be toggled between true and false. Metabind input fields explained. The Metabind code syntax consists of two methods. You have the inline method and the code method. So to trigger the Metabind input field, you start by choosing your code syntax method. So if we look at the first one here, inline, we need to put a backtick followed by the word input in capitals, then a left square bracket and the name of the identifier. So this will be listed in our documentation as our input field. We'll go through this in the next section of the video. We then have an argument, and each input field can have its own argument with a value in parentheses. Then a colon is at the end with the bind target, and the bind target is the name of our YAML property. So this will make more sense as we go through the video. We can see in the code block it's exactly the same, except we're using our 3 backticks and the word metabind in order to call our code. So let's go explore how to create these two methods. Creating metabind input fields. There are two ways of creating an input field in your note. The first is using an inline code block. So you simply just type the word input in capitals, then put a left square bracket and type the name of your input field. In this case, it will be the text area. Then we close it with a right square bracket. And because it's inline, we just need to jump into reading mode in order to preview our metabind input field. The second method is using a code block. So we put 3 backticks followed by the word metabind, and then we simply just repeat the process. So we just take the input followed by our left and right square bracket and the name of our input field. And that will give us the same result as the inline code block. Not all input fields allow inline and code blocks. So you do need to check the documentation in order to see if this is going to work. Binding input fields to metadata YAML. Input fields can and should be bound to metadata fields. These are your YAML properties. So if we start off with our inline code block with the word input, then enter the name of our input field, which is toggle, then we need to bind it to our YAML property. So if we have a look up here, we have a YAML property called habit Obsidian. And we just need to put our colon after the name of our input field, then the name of our YAML property. In this case, it's habit Obsidian. So when we jump back into reading mode, we have our toggle. We have a look at our property here, it's set to false. Then when we switch our toggle on, it sets the property to true. And to achieve the same inside our code block, we just put our code block followed by the word metabind. Then we can paste our inline, take our 2 ticks away. And when we jump back into reading mode, we now have our code block switch. So if you don't specify a bind target, the input field will not preserve the data. What are input field arguments? Some input types support arguments to further customize them. Arguments are specified in parentheses behind the input type. At the time of this recording, there are 16 arguments available for metabind input fields. However, not all arguments are applicable to every input field. We'll explore some of these arguments in more detail later in the video. Metabind input field templates. Inside the Metabind settings, we have a section called Input Field Templates. And if we click on Edit Templates, we can store our input field templates inside the plugin settings. You can see here I've got 3 inline select input fields set up. And the name of those templates are mood, 5 stars, and rate. You'll also notice that these templates are currently not binded to any YAML property, and I'll showcase why. So we start with our backtick, then type in the word input, left square bracket, type the name of our template, which is mood, then close it with a right square bracket. And the next step is we need to bind it to a YAML property. So we need to come up to the top, put our 3 lines to start our properties block. In this case, we'll choose the property overall mood. So we go back down to our example here, and then after our right square bracket, put another square bracket, then a colon, then type in the name of your YAML property. So in this case, overall mood, then close it with a right square bracket. So now we have our template being pulled in, which is mood, binding to our YAML property overall mood up the top here. So we can see that we can now see a inline select field. So if we click that, we can choose our overall mood. So we could say happy. Up in the top YAML property, we now have the happy showing in our YAML property. Let's have a look at another one. So if we jump back into the templates, we can see we have one here for 5 stars. This time we'll use a code block. So 3 backticks, type in the word meta bind, then capitals input, left square bracket, the name of our template, which is 5 stars, then left square bracket. We need to create a YAML property as well. So we'll just create one called rating. I'll come up to my properties and put in the rating there. And then now I have a inline select with my rating. And if I select 5 stars, then it sets my rating to 5 stars in my YAML property. Metabind input fields deep dive. In this section of the video, we're going to go through our 21 input field types. We're going to break these down into 11 categories. Inside each category, we're going to further analyze what arguments can be used for each input field. So get your notebooks ready because this is going to require a little bit of focus. Date and time input fields. We're going to start with the date and time input field category. This category contains the input fields date, date picker, date time, as well as time. So we'll start by looking at the first input field, which is date. So the date identifier is date, all in lowercase. It also allows inline and code blocks. The allowed arguments are class, default value, showcase, and title. We'll start by building our inline input field. So we start with a backtick, type in the word input. Then we put our left square bracket, followed by the identifier, which is date. So now we have our inline date input field. We need to bind it to a YAML property. So we'll go ahead and we'll put date1. Now we can create our YAML property. So we'll come up and put our 3 tags followed by the word date1. We'll choose the property type as date if it's not set already. So now we have our date input field bound to our YAML property date1. If we enable reading view, we can see that we now have a date picker. So if we left click, we can select today's date. Then the YAML date1 is set to today's date. Let's do the same for our code block. So we do our 3 backticks followed by meta bind, and we put in input date binded to date. We'll make this one date2, and we'll go ahead and add our date2 YAML property. So now we have our code block, and we can set this one to be the 20th of January. So we can see up the top there, our 2 YAML properties are set. So we have 4 allowed arguments on the date property. So to add our class, we simply insert after the input field a parentheses with the word class, then another parentheses and the name of the class that we would like to set. So this is going to be a custom CSS property. I'll just put custom date for now. Now, if we want to add our second argument, default value, we need to put a comma, then the second argument, which is default value, then our parentheses and what we would like our default value to be. So I'll set this to be tomorrow's date as well. So I'll put 2025 January, tomorrow's date. So now when we jump into reading view, the default view the default value should be the 20th of January. And this, I don't know if this is a bug, but I've found that a lot of the default value arguments don't work. Also, with the custom CSS, it's a little bit difficult to apply custom CSS to your Metabind input fields. So I'll show you when it does work a bit further in this section, but for now, we'll just make a note of it. So the next one will be comma showcase. And if we go back into reading mode, we can now see that the showcase argument shows us the meta-bind syntax. So now we can actually see what this date input field looks like. And the last one is title. And title simply just gives it a heading 3, my date. Now it has a title called my date. So out of the 4 arguments here, the most useful to me are showcase and title. The other 2 arguments, class and default value, have not been easy to apply. So the date picker is very similar to the date input field. The identifier is date picker and it accepts inline and code blocks. So we'll do our inline first, input followed by our identifier date picker. We need to bind it again, so we'll just use the same property as before, date1. We'll put our 3 tags, then the name of our YAML property, date1. So now we have our inline date picker. This time the date picker shows in the middle of our Obsidian screen, and we can select today's date by set to now or by picking it, or we can navigate through the months up the top here. So we'll just select today's date. We can also do the same as a code block. So 3 backticks followed by meta bind. To save time, we can jump into source mode and just copy our block from the inline. And we'll just change our binded property to date2. We'll add our date2 to our YAML property. Now we have our code block. We can also set that one to today's date. The allowed arguments are the same. So if we go back into our source mode, we already know the class and the default value won't work. So we'll just skip over to showcase. Then we'll also put comma title and we'll make this one example. And then if we preview that, we can see that we are showcasing the input field here. And we're also giving it a heading 3 of example, and it's binded to date2. Our next input field is date time. This one uses the identifier date time. It also is allowed inline and code block. So we'll just simply copy our identifier and start with our inline, input square bracket date time, bind it to our date1. We'll go add our YAML property date1. Now we have our date time. So we'll select our calendar. We'll make today's date the date, and it will just go ahead and set the time it is now, which is 5:57 p.m. We can do the same for our code block. So we'll jump into source mode, and we'll just do our 3 backticks, meta bind, then copy and paste from our inline, make that one date2, add our date2 YAML property. Now we have our code block, date time. We could set that to tomorrow, the same time, or AM. So this could be good for setting a deadline or a due date. We know that class and default value are not easy to set, but we can showcase as well as give it a title. So we'll put our showcase, our title as example. Now we have our code blocked showcased with our title example. And our final date and time input field is time on its own. So we have the identifier time. So we'll start with our inline, input square bracket time. We'll bind this to a YAML property called set time, the time now, which is 6 p.m. We can see that it's set it to 24-hour time because this is what we've set in our Obsidian settings. We'll do the same for our code block. So meta bind. We'll jump into source mode. We'll just copy and we'll say set time to. So now we can see we've got our code block where we can set our second time, which might be 6 a.m. in the morning. We know our class and default value are not going to be very useful. So we will just add our showcase so we can see our syntax as well as a title. And we'll call this one set time. So now I have the code block saying set time and showcasing my code, text and editor input fields. So we'll move on to our next category now, which is our text input fields. In this section of the video, we'll cover how to create a text area, and editor input field. We'll start with the text input field, and the identifier for text is simply lowercase text. So text works with inline and code blocks, and we have a couple of additional arguments which we haven't covered so far. So we'll start with our input square bracket, enter the name of our input field, which is text. Then we're going to put our colon text. So we'll go up and do our 3 tags, put in text as our property. We can choose our property type as text. So now we have our inline text input field. We can type in amazing and it comes up and shows me amazing. And I've got a second property there because you can see I've created my YAML property with a capital T. And because I hadn't added that text with a capital T, it's gone and created that YAML property for me. So we can take out this one. Now we'll do the same for our code block, and we'll just copy and paste and put 2 more backticks followed by the word metabind. You can see it gets a little bit messy, so we'll just copy and paste that down there and take one of the backticks away. And this will be text2, and we'll go put in text2, and that is working, updating our YAML property. So now let's have a look at the allowed arguments. In this instance, class is a little bit easier. So we can go put a class, and there's a class in the style sheet inside the Metabind plugin. And I know what it's called because I've had a look in there, and it's called Metabind full width. So let's preview what that one does. We can see now my text field is using the full width of my note. So that could be useful if I want to add some more characters into my input field. So let's go back and take out the property setting, and then we'll add default value. So we'll come in between our curly bracket, put a comma, type in our next argument, which is default value, and we'll put in test as our default value. So let's preview that. So we can see that the default value hasn't entered up here or down here. It still says text and there's no test added there. So our default value is useless in this case. So we'll put a comma and we'll do our placeholder, and we'll make our placeholder enter your text. Let's preview that, and it says now a placeholder of enter your text. So that could be useful when we want to prompt ourselves to add something in the text field. So let's go back and have a look at our next one, which is showcase. So we'll add our showcase. So now we can actually see what we've written so far, and we can see that that's working. So we've got 2 more arguments we can use, which is our title. So comma, title, enter your text. And then we'll also put a limit in. So a limit will limit the amount of characters. So say we want to limit to 10, and then we'll jump back into reading mode. So now you can see there's a little counter here, and we can see it because it's being showcased. And we've also entered a H3 title, which is enter your text. So let's enter some text. Okay, so I can't go past the limit of 10, which is what I expected. So we can see that that is working as expected. So if you ever get stuck, you'll notice there's a little hand icon here. So if I click that, it's going to open the web viewer. And this is only if you're running Obsidian version 1.8.0 and above. And we can see that it's taken me to the Metabind docs for the text input field. And then it's got some documentation here on the allowed arguments. So if my default value wasn't working, I could click in and have a read through and look at examples. So that could be quite handy if you get stuck. Let's now look at the next input field, which is text area, which has the identifier text area. So we'll start with our inline, put in our input square bracket text area. We need to create our YAML property. So we'll go make this one summary. So we'll go put our 3 lines with the YAML property summary. So there we have our text area. So this gives us a little bit more breathing space to work with in our text area. So let's test it. So we can see that that is updating in my summary as I would like it to. We'll jump into source mode and we'll create our code block. We'll make this one Metabind bind. We'll cut, paste, remove our extra backtick. So now we have our summary 2. Add the YAML property. Have a look at that. We just can copy and paste into our second summary, and we can see that it is adding that to our YAML property as well. So let's have a look at our arguments now. So we can use the same class as we did for the text field, but because we've already covered that, I think we'll skip that. I know the default value doesn't work, so we'll skip that one as well. The placeholder does work, so we can put in placeholder, enter your text. But you see how this is not yellow here, it's white. So this indicates that there is something wrong here. So if I put another curly bracket there, you can see now it's gone yellow. So that means that the syntax is correct. So that's just something to note. If you don't see the yellow input field or argument being recognized, then you're probably missing a curly close bracket or some other type of syntax. We'll also showcase and comma, put a title. We'll just make this one example, and we'll limit this one to probably a little bit more characters, say 50. And we can also see that we don't have valid syntax again. So we've made a mistake. So let's take out one of our curly brackets, and that still doesn't like it. So I can see here after example, I need to close that. Then I've got my comma, then the next argument, which is limit, followed by 50. And now if I go into reading mode, you can see there's a warning here. So we can click that and it'll tell us what the warning is. Encountered invalid identifier. So it received placeholder. So we need to go have a look at that. So let's come back here, and with placeholder, it's case sensitive. So if we go put AP, now we don't have that error. So that's another one that trips you up, is it's yellow. So you think it's working, but because it's case sensitive, we got the error there. And you can always check by clicking, going into your docs, and you can see down here, the argument is the lowercase placeholder. The last one in this category is the editor, and the identifier is simply editor. In this case, we can't use editor as inline, so I'll put a strike through that option, but we can as a code block. So we go 3 backticks followed by meta bind, then put in the word input, square bracket, editor. And we want to bind this to our summary again. So we need to create our summary. We can see that the editor has appeared. So there's our editor right there. So the advantage of using a editor is we can use Markdown. So if we put a heading 1, then a heading 2, we can see that that is putting that into our YAML property up the top here. But when we jump into reading view, we can see that we now have our Markdown supported inside our editor. So this could be handy if you want to link to a note or another section of your vault, or you simply just want to add some more flair to your text editor. So we don't really have too many arguments to use here besides class, default value, showcase, and title. If we jump back into source mode, we can put a bracket. We can try put class, brackets again, and then we need to find a class to put in there. So I'll just write custom CSS for now. Then we can put a comma and default value. We know that default value is buggy. Put our next one, which will be showcase. Then our next one, title, editor. Now we can see that we have a syntax error here. So we need to have a look to see if we can fix that. So we probably just need another curly bracket, and that closes our syntax. So now we have a valid code block, and we can see that we are showcasing our input field editor. We can potentially add a custom CSS class. The default value buggy doesn't work, and our title is editor. Image input fields. We'll now look at the image category. In this category, we'll be looking at image list suggester, image suggester. So we'll have a look at the image list suggester. So our image list suggester input field allows for multiple selections from a gallery of images. And those images can be moved or deleted from the selected images. So the identifier is image list suggester. It doesn't support inline, but it does support code blocks. So we do our 3 backticks followed by the word metabind, put in our input with our identifier, image list suggester. So class will apply a custom CSS and default value will add a default value. So I know these two are a little bit troublesome, so I'm going to skip those and go straight to the option. So the option allows us to select a specific value, and it's a single value. So we'll just put our parentheses followed by option and parentheses again. We need to specify what option we want to put in here. So I'm going to choose a book cover from my toolkit images book covers, and it's going to be called Be Unstoppable by Aidan Mills. I'll put the full location in there, and it needs to be in quotations because we have a space here and a space here. We also need to bind it to a YAML property. So we'll put our colon followed by the word image. Then we're going to create our YAML property called image. And I'm going to enter, put a tag, and then the name of the image that I've added. So now we'll preview that. And we can see that it's now showing the image that we have selected, Be Unstoppable. We also have an option query here. So if we change this argument to option query, we can tell the image list suggester that we want to look for all the book covers, not just the individual book cover. So we'll take away the name of the book and just put the location of our book covers. Now when we go to reading view and hit add new image, it'll present us with all the book covers and we can select another book cover. And if we want to right click, we can move it to the left, or we can right click, move it to the right. We can copy the image path, or we can remove the image and add another image. We can see that we also have the argument showcase, as well as a comma title, put our parentheses, some images. So now when we jump into a reading view, we can see we have our title, pick some images, and we're showcasing our syntax. So the next one is image suggester. So the image suggester input field allows for a selection from a gallery of images. It's a little bit similar to the image list suggester. So it doesn't support inline, and the identifier is image suggester. So we'll start with our code block, which is metabind, input image suggester. We need to bind it to a YAML property as well. So we'll use image, and then we'll just go create our YAML property image. So now we have our YAML property image. You'll notice that we don't see anything here. So let's jump into source mode, and we need to add a argument. So we don't really want to customize the CSS or put a default value, but we do want to select either an option or an option query. So an option will choose a single image, whereas an option query will search from a variety of images. So I think we'll use the option query. So we'll put our parentheses, option query, parentheses again. We need to specify the location where we want to query our images. So this could be a tag, or it could be a folder location. So we'll just put our toolkit image book covers, and we'll make sure they're in quotations because we do have spaces in between our name here. So let's preview that. So you notice there's still nothing showing here. Now I'm not sure if this is a bug, but if I jump back into source mode and go in between our curly brackets here, and I'll just type in the word showcase so we can see the code block. So now I can see the code block, and you can see over here hidden on the right hand side, there's my little change image trigger pencil, which is what this image suggester input field does. So if I click that, then you can see that it's failing to query the book covers folder location. So let's see what else we can do. So let's come back into our source mode. I'm just going to add the toolkit book covers up the top here. And then we'll preview that. You can see that we're still having issues looking in our book covers directory. So let's take out the trailing slash. Now we can see all our book covers. So let's select this one here. So now we have our YAML property set up the top as our book cover that we've just selected. If we right click, there's no options because the image suggester only allows one image. So if we click the pencil again and change it to this one, we can see that it replaces the image that is in the input field. So we can also put a title. So put title and we'll say select an image. So now we have our title, select an image, and we have our pencil to change our book cover. So I don't know why this only works if we showcase the syntax, but it's something to keep in mind if you are using the image suggester. Select input fields. The next category is select and multi-select category. In this category, we'll cover the input fields select, inline select, and multi-select. We'll start with the select input field. The identifier is select. Doesn't support inline syntax, so we'll go straight for the code block. So we'll start with our 3 backticks, followed by metabind, and we put in input with our identifier select. Now we need to specify an argument to provide the input field with the values that we want to select from. So we'll put our parentheses option, parentheses again, and then we just need to enter our options. So we might make this one our favorite food. So we'll start with popcorn. I'm going to use a little emoji here. Then I'm going to put a comma, and I'm also going to copy and paste so that when I select popcorn with an emoji, it sets my YAML property with the emoji as well. So I have my first option. I'll copy and paste to save time for the remaining options. So now I have 5 options. I have popcorn, pizza, hot dog, burger, and salad. We want to bind it to a YAML property. So I'm just going to make one called select food. Then I'll put my 3 dashes select food YAML property. Let's see if we can add a default value. So after our salad, we'll put in default value. We need to place a comma at the beginning, and then we need to specify our default value. So we'll choose salad as our default value. Then we want to showcase the code block, and we'll give it a title of my favorite food. So preview that in reading mode. So you can see that we have our title, my favorite food. We're showcasing the code block. If we choose popcorn, it sets the YAML property. If we choose pizza, it sets the YAML property. So that's working. So the only thing that's not working is my default value. So I can take my default value out. So I'm happy with that. So we'll now look at the multi-select input field. The identifier is multi-select. It's not supported by Inline. And we'll start with our code block, put in metabind input, followed by our identifier. Now we need to specify the option again, like we did in our select. To save time, I'm just going to come in and paste one that I've already created. And this time it's going to be a habit. So we're going to choose multiple habits that we've completed for the day. Got our options in there. We also need to bind it to a YAML property. So we'll put multi-habit select. Then I'll add my 3 dashes multi-habit select YAML property. Got an error showing here. So let's try put the showcase at the beginning. Now we're showcasing our code block. I can also give it a title. It could be my daily habits. So now I've got my title, my daily habits, and I can choose my daily habits for the day, and they are setting up in my YAML property. So we'll now look at the inline select. This input field functions like a drop-down menu. and allows you to select a certain value from a list of options. And the options can be added using the option argument. It's allowed inline and code block, and the identifier is inline select. So we'll start with the inline. We'll put our input, then we'll put our identifier. We need to specify an option, so parentheses option, then the name of our option. So we'll make this one a status. So we'll put parentheses again, and we'll just put none. Then we'll put a comma, we'll put another option, parentheses, and this one will be archives. I'm just going to paste in the rest of the options to save some time. So we have all our options added. We now need to bind it to a YAML property. So we'll put our colon followed by the name of our YAML property. In this case, it'll be Vault status. Then I'll put my 3 tags, add my Vault status YAML property at the top of my note. So now if I preview, I have an inline select input field with all my options that I've added. And if I choose one of the options, it sets my YAML property up the top here under Vault status. So if we jump into the source mode, we can see that the last option here is YouTube, but the option we selected is with an emoji, then the word YouTube. So if we want to include the emoji as well, we need to put it in the first value here. And if we test that and now select YouTube, we can see that it's copying the emoji as well. So if you do want to have a select value on the right, but have the set YAML property to be different, then that's how you would set it up. We can also add our showcase, title, and we'll call the title Vault status. Now, if we preview that, we can see that we have our inline, but we don't have our title. So title doesn't work on the inline. So that's just something to note. If you do want to use a title, you will need to use it on the code block. So 3 backticks, meta bind. To save time, we'll just copy our syntax from the top here. Then we'll put our comma, title, enter, Vault status. So now when we preview, we have our heading 3 title, enter Vault status, and then we have our status here. And when we change, it updates in our YAML property. So this could work for a reading status. So you could have your reading status set. You could do it for a rating status, and this could be a rating out of 5. You could also have something like a rating the week status, and this could be in a journal to rate the week. List input fields. We'll now look at the list category, and this category is going to cover the input fields inline list suggester, and lists. So we'll start with the inline list identifier inline list. It supports inline and code blocks. So we'll start with our inline, then we'll add our identifier. We need to bind it to a YAML property. So we'll just bind it to list, go up to the top, put in our 3 lines, add list. Now we have a little plus icon showing. If we left click the plus icon, it asks us to create a new list element. So we could make these static. So we could say item 1, and now we have our first item and it shows up the top as a clickable item. We could also add existing notes in our vault by putting our 2 square brackets followed by the name of our note. Now you need to know the name of your note. You can't do a search for it. So you would need to know, and then you can see that it's added the callouts note from my vault there. So that could be handy if you wanted to create an inline list for notes inside your vault. We also have the option to create a code block. So we do our 3 backticks followed by meta bind, put in input, add our inline list identifier. Then we want to bind our YAML property. So we can just create a list2. Then we add our list2 YAML property to our properties block, properties up the top. So looking at the allowed arguments, the class, the default value, and the placeholder are not going to be very useful in this instance. I know the placeholder doesn't work. Also know the default value doesn't work. And class is if I want to add a custom CSS, which I don't want to do. So that really only leaves me with showcase title and putting a limit on how many characters. So if we jump back in, we can put our parentheses, put our showcase first, then our title. We might give it a title of enter a list item, then a comma followed by a limit, and we only want to allow 20 characters. So if we preview that, we can see that we can now only enter 20 characters. We have enter a list item heading 3. We will try add the placeholder just to see if it works. I'll just put it here after showcase. And I'll just say test, and then I'll put a comma after that to make it valid syntax. And then we can see that there's no placeholder here and there's no placeholder here. So I know that the placeholder is not going to work. You can also do the same for default value and preview that. We can see default value here. I've got test here. So default value is actually working here. So it gives me a list item, but it doesn't add that list item to my YAML property up the top there. So I can add a default value, but it doesn't add it there. So if I click the plus and type in test2, it will add that default value once I add the second value. So that is what the default value argument will allow you to do with an inline list input field. So our next list input field is inline list suggester. This one uses the identifier inline list suggester. It supports inline and code blocks. So we'll start with our inline, put in our input square brackets identifier. Now you'll notice we've got a few more allowed arguments, but the main one is going to be option or option query. So we'll start with our option. So I'm just going to put parentheses, option, then parentheses again, and I need to specify the option that I want to add. So in this case, I'll say select, then I'll put a comma, and I need to add my second option, parentheses, and then what my second option is. So I might just put a angry face here, and I'm going to type in the word angry. So that's my second option. To save time, I'll go and paste the remaining options. So now I've got all my options added. I can bind my YAML property. So I'll put my colon, and I'm just going to put overall mood as my YAML property. So then I need to add that up the top, overall mood. So you can see that it's added a plus icon again. So if I click on the plus, then it's going to display all the options that I've put in. And if I select excited, it'll add excited. If I select happy, it'll add happy. So I know that one is working as expected. So we'll do the same for our code block. So we'll jump into our source mode, put in our 3 backticks, meta bind. We'll just paste the inline from above, but this time we'll add showcase. We'll also add a title, and we'll give it a title of what is your mood. You also notice we've got this argument use links. So this one just allows us to use links if we were using a option query. So if we were querying some notes and we wanted to use links on those list suggesters, then that's what the use links is going to allow us to do. So the allow other will allow us to select another option that we haven't added. So we'll add that one in. So we'll go comma, space, allow other. So now if we preview that, we should see our code block there. And if we hit our plus, we can see that we've got this option here. So because we've specified allow other, we can choose from our options, which we've already predefined, or we can specify a custom allow other element in our text field here. So if there was a mood that wasn't in there, then we can add it manually. Our final argument is the option query. So if we take out all our options here and we just put in our option query, then we need to specify what our query is, and we'll just put a tag and we'll type in book and we'll see what that comes back with. And this, we might actually just change the YAML property here as well to book, and we'll come up the top and we'll put a book YAML property there. So now when we select our plus, it's going to search all our vault with the notes with the tag book, and it's going to allow us to add those to our inline list suggester. So we'll just choose this one here. So there we have it there. Now see how it's a link? That's because we're using links by default. So if we don't want them to be links, parentheses and choose false, so that when we select our next one, then it's no longer a link. It's just going to place it in as text. Be handy if you don't want to use links. So the list suggester is very similar to the inline list suggester. The identifier is list suggester. It doesn't support inline, so we can only use code blocks. So we'll put in our metabind input list suggester. Now our list needs to be lowercase l, so we just need to tidy that one up. Now this one's going to be quite similar. You can notice this time it says add new item instead of a plus icon. So what we might do is we'll come back in here and we'll start with an option query this time. Put our parentheses, and we'll just use our book tag again, and we'll also use showcase title. We'll make our title select your book. We can specify whether to use links or not. So remember, using links is default true. So even if we put in use links true, it's already true. So we could make that false, and we can still use the allow other, which is going to allow us to specify an additional value. So we could either make that true or also false. Now I'll trial the default value and we'll just put that one in as test. So let's have a look at that. So we have our title, which is select your book. We're showcasing the code block. We've got the option query as books, and we can see that the default value is test here. So it's already added test for us. Allow other is set to false. So if we select add new item, it queries our book tag again. So anything with the book tag, we can select this one, how to write a book. We can see that use links is false, so there's no link to it. We can see it, we haven't bound it to a YAML property, so it's not going to save. So we need to go back into code block and bind it to our YAML property. We'll just say list again, add list up the top. So now when we select our option, it shows up the top there as a list item, but it's not clickable until we go in and use links as true. And we'll go add that same note again. Now we can open that as a new note. So the last input field is list. This has the identifier list. It's not supported inline, but it's supported with code block. So put our 3 backticks, enter metabind, input square brackets list. So you can see we now have an empty with a new entry here, and then a plus over on the right hand side there. So we can bind this to a YAML property. We might want to call it my list. We'll add that up the top here as my list. So now I have a YAML property for my list. Put in a new entry. We'll just call this one test. Now I've got a new entry called test. So what else can we do? We can put a placeholder. So we'll put placeholder. I'll just call this one my placeholder. So we can see that that's put a placeholder inside my text field. So that might be useful if I come in and say, enter your list item. We'll also use showcase and we'll give it a title. And the title could be enter item. Then we could limit the amount of characters to 20. got this option to multi-line. Now, at the time of making the recording, the multi-line argument is not completed in the documentation, so this may be something that may be added in the future. Numbers input fields. Let's now take a look at the numbers category. In this category, we are going to cover number, progress bar, and slider. We'll start with number. A number input field is a text-like input field, but it only accepts numbers. The identifier is number, and it's allowed in inline and code block. We'll start with inline, put our number identifier, add an argument, we'll put a default value, we'll make the default value 1, and we want to showcase and give it a title, my number. So let's preview that. So we can see that it is accepting the default value argument with the number 1. It's not showcasing my input. Let's bind it to a YAML property and we'll just call it number. Go up the top and we'll add a YAML property number. Make sure the property type is set to number. We have an error here, so we just need to move this to outside our parentheses. Now if we view that, we can see we have our default value 1, but it doesn't enter until we take it out and then put it in. So that's just something to note with the default value. We also don't have showcase working in this instance, which is interesting for our inline. So let's just move it around. It's still the same. So that's just something else to notice with the number input field. So let's try with a code block. So we'll put in our meta bind, then we'll just grab the syntax from the top here, place that in our code block. So now we have our title showing, which is my number. We also have the showcase working, and we have the default value working as well. There is another argument we can use, which is placeholder. So let's put in a placeholder. I'll just say enter your number. Now we need to put a comma here as well and pull that space back there. So our next numbers input field is progress bar. So we have our identifier progress bar. It doesn't accept inline, so we'll go straight for the code block, put in our meta bind input followed by our identifier. You'll notice we have a few arguments here that we haven't seen before, such as max value, min value, and step size. So let's start with our min value. So this is going to be the minimal value of our progress bar. So we'll make it 0. Then we need to put a max value, and we might say 100. So that's going to give us a progress bar from 0 to 100. We want to add a step size. So how many steps does the bar increment when we move it? So we'll say 10. Then we're going to showcase and give it a title. We'll say my progress. So we'll preview that. Now we have a progress bar from 0 to 100. When we click, it steps in increments of 10. We can see that that's counting up as we thought it would. Let's try add a default value. So we'll say default value 50. And I also want to add a class. And we'll call this one red progress bar. So now I have a default value and a class. So you can see that it didn't actually apply that default value. So let's try and bind it to a YAML property. So my progress, put that up the top here, my progress, make that a number. Now, if we preview that, we can see that the default value is set to 50. Now, we still don't have our red progress bar. So let's go have a look at that one. So I'm just going to come into my Visual Studio Code and I'm going to add a new snippet here. I'm going to turn my progress bar to red. You can see now it's the color red and that changes my progress bar color. We'll now look at the last numbers input field, which is slider. So we have the identifier slider and it works inline as well as code block. So we'll start with the inline. We've got slider. So we'll just do a simple showcase, and we'll bind it to our YAML property called slider. And we'll create our YAML property slider. We might want to make that a number. So now we have a basic inline slider. It's not showcasing our code in the inline, so that's fine. So let's go back in and create our code block. Now we have our code block. Let's add some more arguments. We'll start with the add labels. The add labels argument lets us add labels to our sliders as well as our progress bars. So it needs to be a true or a false. So in this instance, we'll make it true. We can give the slider a default value. So we'll set the default value on 50. We're going to make the minimum value 0, and we'll make the maximum value 100. We can add a step size on how many steps the slider will increment. So we'll make that 10. Then we want to showcase our input field syntax and add a title, and we'll call this one my slider. So now if we preview that, we have an error. So we need to go debug our error. So the error is we don't have a YAML property, so we need to create our YAML property up the top. We'll make the property type a number. We've also got 2 showcases, so we can remove one of the additional showcases. Now we have our add label showing from our minimal value of 0 to our maximum value of 100. We have a step size of 10, and we can see that that's incrementing up the top. And we also have our heading 3 title called My Slider. Suggester input fields. So we'll now look at the suggester category. And inside this category, we will just cover a simple suggester with data view and some more variations. The suggester uses the identifier suggester. It's supported with inline and code blocks. So we'll start with our inline. We'll add our identifier. So we need to specify some options in our suggester. So we'll put our parentheses, option, then what option we want to use. I might use a Windows key full stop, and I'm going to use just a star here. So 1 star will be my first option. And then I'll just copy this 5 times. So now I have 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 star, and 5 star. I need to bind it to a YAML property. So I'll call this one star rating, and then I'll add my YAML property at the top called star rating. So you can see now I have null, and if I click, it gives me the 5 options. And if I select 5 star, it sets my star rating. So we know that one is working. So that's our basic suggester. Let's have a look at a code block and use some more options. So we'll start with our 3 backticks, followed by the word metabind. We'll put in input, followed by suggester. Then this time we'll use a option query, parentheses, and we'll put our tag book inside there. And we might bind this to a property my book, and then we'll add the my book property up the top there. So now we still have our null, and if we click, it searches all my notes with the tag book. So I can choose this one here, Elon Musk by Walter Isaacson. We can see that that is targeting that note. So let's have a look at our other arguments here. So we can showcase our code. We can also give it a title, choose a book. Then we can use links. So by default, remember, use links is true. So if we don't want our book to be a link, we can make it false. And then we've also got allow other, and this is if we want to enter something that's not with the tag book. So if we have a look at that, we have an error. So our error use links false, expected a argument, and it's just because we didn't put the S on the end. So if we have a look here and just go back into our syntax and just add our missing S, now we have valid syntax. So if we select our pencil, because we've allowed other true, then we set the suggester value. If I just hit OK with nothing, you see it doesn't query my tag book. So I don't think that's very useful. So we can take out allow other, then test again. Now we can go back to our books. And if we select that same book again, we can see now it's not clickable, and it's not clickable here either because use links is set to false. So I don't know where you'd use links false. What I'd usually do is just leave it out completely so that when you choose the book, it has the link to that note. Toggle input field. Our last category is the toggle category. In this category, we will cover a basic toggle as well as a custom toggle. So the identifier is toggle and it's supported by inline and code block. So we'll start with our inline. So we have our input toggle. We need to bind it to a YAML property. So we'll bind this one to toggle1. Then we'll go add our 3 dashes toggle1. We'll also do our toggle2 because we're going to set up a second one. So you can see I've got just my basic toggle switch on and off, which sets my toggle1 to true or false in my YAML property. So let's go back into source mode, do our 3 backticks, put in meta bind. We'll just copy our toggle from our inline. We'll call this one toggle2. And let's add a few arguments. So we'll skip the custom CSS. We'll try put a default value and we'll make it true. So let's preview that. So you can see it's set it as on, but it hasn't set our YAML property. This is set to a number. So let's change it to a checkbox. And we can see that it will enable when we flick it, but if it wasn't set to true, then it just has a little line through the checkbox with the switch on. So we might not want that, so we can take out our default value. We also have 2 new arguments, off value. So this allows us to specify a custom value for the off switch. So if we did want to make it a number, we could make off 0, and then we could make our on value 1, so that now when we change our property type to our toggle2 to number and turn on the switch, it gives us the on value of 1. And if we switch it off, it gives us the off value of 0. So that could be useful. Come back into our source, and we've also got showcase and our title. Our title could be switch. So we have our title switch, our on and off 0 and 1 value, and we're showcasing our code block. So a good use of the MetaBind toggle is for a daily note habit tracker where you can simply switch on the habits that you've completed for the day. Getting started with MetaBind input fields. If you've made it this far into the video, it means that you're interested in learning how to use MetaBind input fields in your Obsidian Vault. So to get started, go click on the settings icon, navigate over to community plugins, click on the browse button and do a search for MetaBind. Install and enable the MetaBind plugin. Once you've installed the MetaBind plugin, you'll notice up the top here, you've got a link to the docs. And if we click the docs button, that will open the MetaBind documentation. Inside the documentation, you have installation, examples, styling, all the information about the input fields that we covered in the video, as well as the arguments. So this is good as a reference point when you just want to be reminded what the identifier is, whether it's supported in a code block or inline. And it'll also just quickly give you links to the allowed arguments where you can click and read about what the argument does. There's also a link to GitHub, and the GitHub has a issues tab where you can post any issues with the plugin. There's also a discussion tab, and inside the discussion, there's a few categories here that may help you on your journey. You can also launch the command palette and type in MetaBind. Then inside, you've got the option to open the docs, help, or the MetaBind playground. If you open the MetaBind playground and scroll down, you will see examples of all the input fields, with their code block. So this could be handy if you just want something to reference from. Inside the GitHub repository, there is an example vault, and this can be downloaded by simply going up to code and hitting download. Then it's simply a matter of clicking and going to manage vaults and selecting open. Navigate to the extracted example vault and then select folder. Then inside the example vault, you will have a whole bunch of examples that can help you get started. Did you know that MetaBind can also create view fields and buttons? So view fields are a powerful way to reactively display your YAML metadata in your notes. And you can bind these to multiple front matter fields, and they update dynamically. So think of it like a data view inline query, but with instant updates. We haven't spoken about MetaBind buttons today, but if you're interested in learning more about MetaBind buttons, check out my video, How I Use MetaBind to Create Interactive Buttons in Obsidian. I hope this video has given you valuable insights into using the MetaBind plugin to transform your Obsidian Vault. If you found it helpful, consider sharing with a fellow Obsidian user who might benefit. I'd also love to hear how you're using MetaBind in your Vault. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.